The old pickup truck wheezed and coughed as it pulled over to the side of the dusty road. Steam rose from under the hood like a tired sigh. Carlos turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He didn't want to look at his family. He didn't want to see the worry in his wife's eyes or the confusion on his children's faces. 3 days. They had been driving for 3 days, chasing rumors of work at different farms. Each time they arrived, the story was the same. Sorry, we already hired enough people, or the job's been filled. Sometimes the farmers wouldn't even come out to talk to them. They'd just wave them away from behind their screen doors. Maria shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. At 8 months pregnant, every bump in the road felt like a mountain. Her back ached constantly, and her feet were swollen inside her worn shoes. She placed a gentle hand on her belly and felt the baby kick. Even the little one inside seemed restless, as if sensing the family's growing desperation. "Daddy, I'm thirsty," whispered Sophia from the back seat. She was 7 years old, but tried so hard to be grown up. She never complained, even when Carlos knew she must be scared and confused about why they kept driving from place to place. Her little brother Miguel wasn't as patient. At 5 years old, he didn't understand why they couldn't just go home. "When are we going back to our house?" he asked, his voice small and tired. Carlos felt his heart break a little more. They had no house to go back to. The apartment they'd been renting was gone. The landlord had sold the building, and the new owner wanted everyone out. With no steady work and barely enough money for gas, they had packed everything they owned into the back of their old truck and hit the road. "Soon, little man," Carlos lied, his voice rough. "We'll find a place soon." He opened the truck door and stepped out into the late afternoon heat. The sun was getting lower in the sky, painting everything golden. They were somewhere in the middle of farming country, surrounded by fields and orchards as far as the eye could see. The air smelled of dust and growing things. Maria struggled to get out of the truck, one hand supporting her back. Carlos hurried around to help her, but she was already standing, breathing heavily from the effort. She had been so strong through all of this. Stronger than him, if he was being honest. The children climbed out and stretched their legs. They had been sitting in that truck for hours, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks. Sophia's long dark hair was tangled, and Miguel's clothes were wrinkled and dusty. Both of them looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Carlos opened the hood of the truck and stepped back as more steam escaped. He didn't know much about engines, but he could see that something was very wrong. They were stuck, at least for now. "What's that smell?" Maria asked, wrinkling her nose. Carlos sniffed the air. Beyond the smell of the overheated engine, there was something else, something sweet and fresh. He looked around and realized they had stopped near a large apple orchard. Row after row of apple trees stretched up the hillside, their branches heavy with fruit. Some of the apples had grown so big and ripe that they were falling to the ground. Miguel noticed the orchard too. His eyes went wide, and he pressed his face against the chain-link fence that ran along the road. "Look at all those apples!" He sighed, his voice full of wonder. Sophia joined her brother at the fence. "They're everywhere," she whispered. Carlos felt his stomach clench. Not from hunger, though that was always there now, but from shame. When was the last time his children had eaten fresh fruit? When was the last time any of them had eaten a real meal? Yesterday? The day before? It was all blurring together. They had been living on gas station snacks and whatever cheap food they could find. Stale bread, crackers, sometimes nothing at all. Carlos had been giving most of his food to Maria and the children, telling them he wasn't hungry. But the truth was, he was always hungry now. They all were. Maria walked over to where the children stood at the fence. She moved slowly, one hand on her lower back. "They do look good," she said quietly. Some of the apples on the ground near the fence were still perfect, red and shiny, just waiting to be picked up. Others were bruised, but still good to eat. Carlos found himself staring at them, his mouth watering despite himself. "Daddy, can we have one?" Miguel asked, his small hand reaching through the fence toward an apple that was just out of reach. "They're not ours, little man," Carlos said. But his voice sounded weak even to himself. A warm breeze blew across the orchard, carrying the sweet smell of ripe apples. Somewhere in the distance, Carlos could hear the sound of farm equipment, but the orchard seemed empty. No workers in sight. No signs of anyone around. Sophia picked up a stick and tried to reach through the fence to knock an apple closer. "There's so many of them just lying on the ground," she said. "Nobody wants them." Carlos knew she was right. Farmers always lost some fruit to the ground. It was normal. But that didn't make it theirs to take. Maria caught his eye and gave him a look he knew well. It was the same look she'd given him when Sophia had a fever and they couldn't afford to take her to the doctor. The same look when Miguel's shoes had holes in them and winter was coming. It was a look that said, "Sometimes we have to do what we have to do." The baby in Maria's belly kicked hard enough that she winced and put both hands on her stomach. She was going to need good food soon. Healthy food. The baby would need her to be strong. Miguel started to cry. Not the loud crying of a tantrum, but the quiet, tired crying of a child who had been brave for too long. "I'm so hungry, Daddy," he whispered. Those words hit Carlos harder than any punch ever could. His son was hungry, and here he stood next to thousands of apples, doing nothing. The sun was getting lower. Soon it would be dark, and they'd have to find somewhere to sleep. Probably in the truck again, all four of them cramped together, trying to stay warm. Maria couldn't keep sleeping in the truck much longer. Not with the baby coming. Carlos looked up and down the road. No cars in sight, no people anywhere. Just, his family, the broken truck, and an orchard full of food they couldn't touch. He walked to the back of the truck and pulled out their water jug, almost empty. He poured a little into a cup and gave it to Miguel, then Sophia, then Maria. There was barely enough left for him to wet his lips. As he put the jug back, he noticed Maria had walked closer to the fence. She was looking at the apples with an expression he'd never seen before. It wasn't want or hunger. It was something deeper. It was the look of a mother who would do anything to feed her children. The orchard stretched up the hill like a green and red carpet. Beautiful and untouchable, or maybe not so untouchable after all. The evening air was getting cooler, but Carlos could feel sweat on his forehead. Not from the heat, but from the decision that was eating at him from the inside. He had been raised to be honest, to work hard for everything he got. His father had taught him that a man's word and his honor were the only things that truly belonged to him, but his father had never stood beside a fence full of food while his pregnant wife swayed on her feet and his children cried from hunger. Miguel's crying had gotten worse. The little boy was trying to be quiet, but his small body was shaking with each sob. He pressed his face against Maria's leg, and she ran her fingers through his hair, making soft, shushing sounds. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, but Carlos could hear the strain in her voice. She was trying to stay strong, but he knew she was reaching her limit too. Sophia had stopped trying to reach the apples with her stick. Instead, she just stood at the fence, staring at all that food with old eyes in her young face. 7 years old, and she already understood that wanting something and being able to have it were two very different things. Carlos walked to the fence and wrapped his fingers around the chain links. The metal was warm from the day's sun. Through the fence, he could see apples scattered on the ground like nature's own grocery store. Red ones, green ones, some with just a small bruise that could easily be cut away. "Nobody's even picking them." "Up," Sophia said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. She was right. These weren't apples hanging on trees that someone was planning to harvest. These were the ones that had already fallen. In a day or two, they'd start to rot. In a week, they'd be food for insects and birds. Nobody would miss them. Carlos tried to push the thought away, but it kept coming back. Nobody would miss them. Maria walked over and stood beside him at the fence. She didn't say anything, just looked at the orchard with tired eyes. The baby kicked again, and she winced, putting both hands on her belly. "How long since you ate something real?" Carlos asked her. Quietly. Maria thought for a moment. "Tuesday, I think." That sandwich we split at the gas station. Tuesday, it was now Friday evening. 3 days of nothing but crackers and water. 3 days of watching his family grow weaker while he drove from farm to farm, begging for work that... Wasn't there... Miguel's stomach made a loud growling sound and the little boy looked down at it in surprise. Any other time it might have been funny. Now it just made Carlos feel like he was failing as a father. "Daddy," Sophia said, tugging on his shirt. "Look." She was pointing to a spot near the fence where several apples had rolled close to the road. One of them was barely a foot away from where they stood. Perfect in red, without a single bruise, Carlos looked up and down the road again, still empty. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the orchard. Soon it would be dark, and they'd have to figure out where to sleep. The truck was too small for all of them, especially with Maria so close to having the baby. "I could just reach through," Sophia said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just one apple, just to see what they taste like." Carlos felt his heart breaking. His daughter shouldn't have to ask permission to eat an apple that was lying on the ground, going to waste. No child should have to be that hungry. He looked at Maria, and she looked back at him. In her eyes, he saw the same thing he was feeling. The same war between what they'd been taught was right and what their family needed to survive. "What if someone sees us?" Maria asked quietly. Carlos looked around again. The orchard stretched up the hill, but he couldn't see a house anywhere. No farm buildings in sight. Just rows and rows of apple trees and the empty road behind them. "The owner probably lives miles away," he said, trying to convince himself as much as her. "These apples are just going to rot anyway." Miguel had stopped crying and was now just sniffling quietly. But Carlos could see how pale his son's face had become. How thin both children were getting. When was the last time they'd smiled? When was the last time they'd played like normal kids? The decision was making itself slowly but surely. Carlos could feel it happening like water flowing downhill. Natural and inevitable. "Just the ones on the ground," he heard himself saying. "Just the ones that have already fallen." Maria nodded slowly. "Just those." Sophia's eyes got wide. "Really? Daddy?" Carlos felt a mix of relief and shame wash over him. Relief that his children might finally get some real food. Shame that it had come to this. "Stay here with Mama," he told the children. "Let me look around first." He walked along the fence line, looking for a gate or an opening. About 50 yards down, he found a spot where the bottom of the fence had pulled away from a post, creating a gap just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Carlos looked back at his family. Maria was holding both children close, and all three of them were watching him with hope in their eyes. Hope that he could fix this. Hope that he could take care of them the way a husband and father should. He got down on his hands and knees and squeezed through the gap in the fence. The grass on the other side felt different under his feet, softer, greener, like he was stepping into someone else's world. The nearest apple was about 10 feet away. Carlos walked to it slowly, his heart pounding. It was beautiful, perfect, the kind of apple his children should be eating every day. Dahi picked it up and felt its weight in his hands. Solid and real, food for his family. Is it good? Sophia called from the fence. Carlos nodded and walked back to the gap. "It's perfect," he said, passing the apple through to her. Sophia took it with both hands like it was made of gold. She looked at it for a moment, then at her parents, then back at the apple. Instead of taking a bite, she held it out to Miguel. "You first," she said. "You're littler." Miguel's face lit up for the first time in days. He took the apple and bit into it, and the sound of that first crunch was like music. Apple juice ran down his chin, and he laughed, actually laughed, as he chewed. "It's so good," he said with his mouth full. "It's the best apple ever." Sophia took the apple back and bit into it too. Her eyes closed as she chewed, like she was trying to remember the taste forever. Carlos watched his children share that apple, passing it back and forth, savoring every bite. Maria was crying quietly, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Get some more," she whispered to him. "Please." Carlos nodded and squeezed back through the fence. This time he moved faster, gathering apples that had fallen near the fence line. He picked the best ones, checking each one for soft spots or holes. Only the good ones. Only what his family needed. As he worked, the sun continued to set, painting the sky orange and pink. Beautiful colors that reminded him there was still beauty in the world, even when everything seemed hopeless. He had filled Maria's shawl with apples when he heard the sound that made his blood turn cold, footsteps, heavy, boots walking across gravel. Getting closer. Carlos froze like a deer caught in headlights. The apples in Maria's shawl suddenly felt as heavy as stones. His heart hammered so hard against his chest that he was sure whoever was walking toward him could hear it from 50 feet away. The footsteps were steady and confident. Not rushing, but not slow either. The kind of walk that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going and had every right to be there. Carlos's mind raced. Should he run? Should he drop the apples and try to explain? Should he call out to Maria and the children to get back in the truck? But his feet wouldn't move. It was like his boots had grown roots right into the orchard soil. What are you folks doing on my property? The voice came from behind a row of apple trees about 30 yards away, deep and weathered like someone who had spent decades working outside. Not angry yet, but definitely not friendly either. Carlos turned slowly toward the voice, still clutching the bundle of apples against his chest. Through the trees he could see a man walking toward him. Older, maybe in his 60s, wearing faded jeans and a work shirt that had seen better days. His gray hair stuck out from under a baseball cap, and his face was tanned from years in the sun. The man stepped into the clearing where Carlos stood, and their eyes met. Carlos had expected anger, maybe shouting, maybe threats to call the police. Instead, he saw something else in the older man's face. Curiosity, maybe? Like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. I asked you a question, the man said, but his tone was more tired than mad. Carlos opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? That he was stealing? That his family was so desperate they were taking apples off the ground like animals? From the fence, he could hear Miguel start to whimper. The little boy had probably heard the stranger's voice and was scared. Maria was shushing him quietly, but Carlos could tell she was frightened too. The older man looked past Carlos toward the fence, and his expression changed slightly. Carlos followed his gaze and saw his family huddled together by the chain link. Maria with her arms around both children, her pregnant belly obvious even from a distance. Sophia trying to hide behind her mother while still peeking out at the stranger. Miguel with apple juice still on his chin, looking like he might start crying again. "Those your kids?" the man asked. Carlos nodded, finding his voice at last. "Yes, sir." "And that's your wife?" "Yes, sir. She's going to have another baby soon." The man looked back at Carlos, then at the bundle of apples he was holding. "So I'll ask again, what are you doing on my property?" This was it. The moment Carlos had to decide what kind of man he was going to be. Would he lie? Make up some story about being lost or looking for work? Or would he tell the truth and face whatever came next? Carlos thought about his children by the fence, about Miguel's happy laugh when he bit into that apple, about Sophia offering her little brother the first bite even though she was just as hungry, about Maria, tired and pregnant and trying so hard to be strong for all of them. He looked the older man straight in the eyes. "We aren't stealing apples, we're just hungry," Carlos said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either hold their weight or collapse and send Carlos tumbling into trouble he couldn't get out of. The older man's eyebrows went up slightly. He hadn't expected that answer. "Just hungry," he repeated. Carlos nodded. "My family... We haven't eaten in 2 days. Real food, I mean. We've been driving around looking for work, but nobody's hiring. Our truck broke down out there on the road," and he gestured helplessly at the apples in his arms. These were just lying on the ground, going to waste. The man was quiet for a long moment, studying Carlos's face like he was reading a book. Carlos could hear his own breathing, loud in the evening air. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was calling, but otherwise the orchard was silent. "You could have lied to me," the man said finally. "Yes, sir, I could have." Could have said you were lost or looking for the owner to ask for work. Yes, sir. But you told me the truth instead. Carlos shifted the bundle of apples to one arm and wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. My children are watching, he said simply. I don't want them to see their father lie. The older man glanced toward the fence again. Sophia had come out from behind Maria and was standing pressed against the chain link. Her small hands wrapped around the metal. She was staring at the two men with wide, worried eyes. How long you been on the road? The man asked. 3 days. Maybe 4, it's hard to keep track. Where you headed? Carlos almost laughed, but it would have sounded bitter. Anywhere that'll have us. Anywhere with work. What kind of work you do? Anything, farm work mostly. I can fix things, build things. I'm not afraid of hard work, sir. I just need a chance. The man nodded slowly, like he was filing away every word Carlos said. What's your name? Carlos Martinez. I'm Frank Morrison. This is my orchard. Carlos felt his stomach drop. This was it. The man was going to call the police or demand payment for the apples or ban them from ever coming back to this area. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry, Carlos said quickly. I know we shouldn't have taken anything without asking. If you want me to pay for these apples, I will. I don't have much money, but I'll find a way. Frank Morrison held up one hand to stop him. Talkin', how much money you got? Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled out a small fold of crumpled bills. He counted them quickly. $18, he said, and some change. Frank stared at the money in Carlos's hand. $18. Probably not enough to buy a tank of gas, let alone feed a family of 4. When's the baby due? Frank asked, nodding toward Maria. Soon, maybe a few weeks. She been to a doctor lately? Carlos looked down at his boots. We can't afford a doctor. Frank was quiet again, but Carlos could see him thinking. The older man's eyes kept moving from Carlos to the family by the fence, then to the apples scattered on the ground around them. You know what I see when I look at you? Frank said finally. Carlos braced himself for whatever was coming. I see a man who's trying to take care of his family the only way he knows how. A man who could have lied to me but didn't. A man who's been carrying a load that's too heavy for one person. Carlos didn't know what to say to that. Frank Morrison looked around his orchard, at the thousands of apples hanging from the trees and lying on the ground. Then he looked back at Carlos, and something in his expression had changed completely. You know what? Frank said, and for the first time his voice sounded almost gentle. I think we need to have a different kind of conversation. He started, walking toward the fence where Maria and the children waited, and after a moment's hesitation, Carlos followed him, still holding the bundle of apples like his life depended on it. Frank Morrison walked toward the fence with slow, steady steps. Carlos followed a few feet behind, his mind spinning with possibilities. None of them seemed good. As they got closer, Maria stepped forward, positioning herself between the stranger and her children. It was instinct, the way mothers do when they sense danger. Her hands rested protectively on Sophia and Miguel's shoulders. Ma'am, Frank said, tipping his baseball cap slightly. I'm Frank Morrison. This is my orchard. Maria's face went pale. Please don't call the police, she said quietly. We'll leave right now. We won't bother you again. Frank stopped walking and looked at her more closely. Even in the fading evening light, he could see how tired she was, how her clothes hung loose everywhere except around her swollen belly, how she swayed slightly on her feet like standing was an effort. When's the last time you ate something? Frank asked her. Maria glanced at Carlos, unsure how to answer. Tell him the truth, Carlos said from behind Frank. He deserves that much. Tuesday, Maria admitted. We shared a sandwich at a gas station. Frank felt something twist in his chest. Tuesday. It was Friday evening now. This pregnant woman hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days. Miguel peeked out from behind Maria's leg. His face was smudged with dirt from the road, and his clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the truck. But his eyes were bright with curiosity as he looked at Frank. Are you going to take our apples away? Miguel asked in his small voice. The question hit Frank harder than he expected. Our apples. Like those few pieces of fruit on the ground were treasure to this little boy. "What's your name, son?" Frank asked, crouching down to Miguel's level. "Miguel." "Martinez," the boy answered, standing up straighter. "I'm 5 years old." 5 years old. "That's pretty big," Frank said. "And what's your sister's name?" Sophia stepped out from behind Maria, trying to look brave even though Frank could see she was nervous. "I'm Sophia. I'm 7. 7? Frank repeated. "I bet you helped take care of your little brother." Sophia nodded seriously. "I tried to. Mama gets tired because of the baby." Frank looked up at Maria, then back at the children. These weren't troublemakers or people trying to take advantage of him. These were just a family in trouble. A family that reminded him of stories his own grandfather used to tell about the Great Depression. When good people lost everything through no fault of their own. He straightened up and looked at Carlos. "You said you can fix things?" Carlos nodded. "Yes, sir. I've worked on farms most of my life. I can repair equipment, fix fences, work with irrigation systems. I'm good with my hands." "What about harvesting?" "I've picked everything from strawberries to cotton. Apples, too, when I was younger." Frank nodded slowly. He'd been dreading this year's apple harvest. At 64, he wasn't as fast as he used to be, and his wife Eleanor had been after him to hire help. But good workers were hard to find, and the ones he could find wanted more money than he could afford to pay. "Eleanor's making pot roast tonight," Frank said suddenly. Everyone stared at him. The comment seemed to come out of nowhere. "My wife," Frank explained. "She always makes too much food. Always telling me we need to have people over more often." He looked at Maria, then at the children. "You folks eaten pot roast lately?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, we don't have money to pay you for a meal." "Did I ask for money?" "No, but—" "Come in," Frank said, the words surprising even himself. "I'll claim you. You're mine now." Carlos stared at him. "Sir? You need work. I need workers. You need a place to stay. I've got an empty house behind the orchard that nobody's used in 2 years. Your wife needs to see a doctor, and Doc Peterson in town is a good man who won't turn away a pregnant woman." The family stood frozen by the fence like they couldn't believe what they were hearing. "I don't understand," Maria said softly. Frank pointed toward the hill behind the orchard. "See that little white house up there? Used to belong to my foreman before he retired. It's got 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom with running water, heat that works, and a roof that doesn't leak." Sophia grabbed Miguel's hand and squeezed it tight. "A real house. With running water and heat. The harvest starts in 2 weeks," Frank continued. "I'll need help from sunrise to sunset for about a month. After that, there's always something needs doing around here. Pruning, maintenance, getting ready for next year." Carlos felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. People didn't just offer strangers jobs and houses and home-cooked meals. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Carlos managed. "Say you'll work hard and treat my orchard like it was your own?" "I will, we will," Frank nodded toward the gap in the fence. "Well then, come on through properly this time. No more sneaking around?" Carlos squeezed back through the gap, then helped Miguel through. Sophia climbed through on her own, and Carlos carefully assisted Maria, supporting her weight as she maneuvered her pregnant belly through the opening dot. As they stood together in the orchard, Frank looked at each of them again. The thin, tired man who told him the truth when he could have. Lead, the pregnant woman who'd put herself between her children and a stranger. The little girl trying to be grown up, and the little boy who shared his apple with his sister. "One thing," Frank said. "Eleanor doesn't know you're coming. She's going to fuss and worry that the house isn't ready and we don't have enough food. Just ignore her when she does that. She loves having people to take care of." Maria wiped tears from her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." "You can thank me by letting Eleanor spoil those children rotten," Frank said. "She's been wanting grandkids for 20 years, but our son lives in California and only visits at Christmas." They started walking up the hill toward the farmhouse. Miguel ran ahead, laughing for the first time in days. Sophia stayed close to her parents, but kept looking around with wonder at the rows of apple trees stretching in every direction. "Mr. Morrison," Carlos said as they walked, "why are you doing this for us?" Frank was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. "You know what I see when I look at this orchard?" he said finally. Carlos shook his head. "I see 30 years of my life. 30 years of planting and pruning and harvesting. My wife and I, we never had much, but we always had enough. Always had food on the table and a warm place to sleep." They reached the top of the hill, and Frank pointed to the farmhouse with its glowing windows and the smell of dinner cooking drifting from the kitchen. "Some people think success means having more than you need," Frank said. "But I learned a long time ago that the real measure of a man isn't what he keeps for himself. It's what he's willing to share when someone else needs it more." As they approached the front door, they could hear someone moving around inside the kitchen. Eleanor getting dinner ready, not knowing that their quiet evening was about to become something much more important. Frank reached for the door handle, then paused and looked back at the family standing behind him. "Ready?" he asked. Carlos looked at Maria, who nodded through her tears. Sophia and Miguel pressed close to their parents, eyes wide with hope and disbelief. "Ready?" Carlos said. Frank opened the door, and the warm light from inside spilled out to welcome them home. 3 months later, Carlos woke up before sunrise, just like he had every morning since they'd arrived at the Morrison orchard, but this morning was different. Instead of the cramped cab of his old truck or a roadside rest stop, he opened his eyes in a real bedroom with clean sheets and a window that looked out over rows of apple trees heavy with fruit ready for harvest. The little white house had become home faster than Carlos ever thought possible. Maria's touch was everywhere now. Curtains she'd sewn from fabric Eleanor had given her, wildflowers from the orchard in mason jars on the kitchen table, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator door. Carlos got dressed quietly and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. Through the window, he could see Frank already moving around in the main farmhouse, probably doing the same thing. They'd developed a routine over these months. Coffee first, then they'd meet by the barn to plan the day's work. The harvest had been the best Frank had seen in years. Carlos had worked from dawn to dusk, picking apples with a speed and care that impressed even the old-timers Frank hired for the busy season. But more than that, Carlos had ideas. Ways to improve the irrigation system, better methods for organizing the harvest, repairs that would save money in the long run. "You're not just a worker," Frank had told him one evening as they finished loading the last truck of the day. "You think like an owner." The words had meant more to Carlos than any paycheck. In the months since that first night, so much had changed. Maria had given birth to baby Rosa at the county hospital, with Eleanor holding her hand through every contraction while Frank paced the waiting room like an expectant grandfather. Carlos had never seen two people get so excited about a baby. That wasn't even their own grandchild. Now Rosa slept peacefully in a crib that Frank had found in his attic, the same crib his own son had used 30 years ago. Eleanor had spent a whole weekend washing and polishing it, humming happily as she worked. Sophia and Miguel had started school in town. The first day had been rough. New school, new kids, clothes that were still hand-me-downs even though they were clean hand-me-downs now. But children adapt faster than adults. And within a few weeks they were coming home with stories about friends and teachers and playground adventures. Sophia had joined the school choir and discovered she had a beautiful singing voice. Miguel had found his calling in the school's small garden, where he helped tend vegetables with the same care he'd learned watching Carlos work in the orchard. "They're blooming," Eleanor had said one evening, watching the children play in the yard, "just like flowers that needed the right soil." Carlos finished his coffee and stepped outside into the cool morning air. October mornings in Apple Country were something special, crisp and clean, with mist rising from the valleys and the smell of ripe fruit everywhere. He walked toward the barn where Frank was already waiting, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Morning," Frank said, handing Carlos one of the mugs. "Morning. How's Eleanor feeling today?" Better. That cold's finally clearing up." Frank sipped his coffee and looked out over the orchard. I've been thinking. Carlos had learned that when Frank said he'd been thinking, it usually meant something important was coming. The Hendersons called yesterday, Frank continued. They want to retire, sell their orchard. It's 40 acres, right next to our east boundary. Carlos nodded. He knew the Henderson place. Good land, well-maintained trees. They're asking a fair price, Frank. Sod, not cheap, but fair. They stood quietly for a moment, both looking in the direction of the Henderson orchard. Thing is, Frank said, Eleanor and I aren't getting any younger. This harvest took more out of me than I'd like to admit. We've been talking about what happens to this place when we're gone. Carlos felt his stomach tighten. Were they about to lose everything again? Had he done something wrong? Our son David has his own life in California, Frank continued. Good job, nice family. He's made it clear he's not interested in running an apple orchard. Can't say I blame him. Frank turned to look at Carlos directly. What would you think about becoming partners? Carlos nearly dropped his coffee mug. Sir? Partners. You and Maria. We've watched how you work, how you care about this place. You don't just see it as a job, you see it as home. Eleanor and I, we'd like to help you buy the Henderson place. Combine it with this orchard. Make it something bigger. Carlos stared at him. Mr. Morrison, I don't have that kind of money. I know that, but you have something more valuable. You have the knowledge and the drive to make it work. We'd work out terms. You'd take over more of the operations here, learn the business side. Eventually, when Eleanor and I are ready to step back completely, you'd buy us out too. I don't know what to say. Frank smiled. Say you'll think about it. Talk it over with Maria. They were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter. Sophia and Miguel came running from the house, already dressed for school, their backpacks bouncing as they ran. Daddy! Daddy! Miguel called out. Come see what Rosa did. Carlos followed the children back to the house, where Maria was sitting at the kitchen table, feeding the baby. Rosa, now 3 months old, was reaching for the spoon with chubby fingers, making a mess and gurgling happily. She's trying to feed herself, Maria laughed. Look at her. Carlos sat down and watched his youngest daughter. She had Maria's dark eyes and his stubborn chin. Born in this place, she would never know what it felt like to be hungry or homeless or unwanted. Frank wants to talk to us about something tonight, Carlos told Maria, something big. Maria looked at him curiously, but Sophia was tugging on his sleeve. Daddy, we have to go or we'll miss the bus. Carlos walked the children to the end of the driveway where the school bus picked them up. As they climbed the steps, Sophia turned back. Don't forget, my choir concert is next week. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Carlos called back. The bus pulled away, and Carlos waved until it disappeared around the bend. Then he walked back, toward the orchard, where Frank was already starting the day's work. As he worked among the apple trees that afternoon, Carlos thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate evening when they'd broken down by the side of the road to this moment, when he was being offered a chance to own the very land where his children played and his wife sang while she cooked dinner. That evening, after Rosa was asleep and the older children were doing homework at the kitchen table, Carlos and Maria sat with Frank and Eleanor in the farmhouse living room. Frank explained his proposal in detail, the partnership, the expansion, the long-term plan that would eventually make the Martinez family full owners of one of the best apple operations in the county. Why us? Maria asked quietly. Why are you willing to do all this for us? Eleanor reached over and squeezed Maria's hand. Because when Frank brought you to our door that first night, we didn't just see a family in need. We saw the family we've been praying for. People who would love this place the way we do. People who would carry it forward. Frank nodded. I told you that first day that I was claiming you, that you were mine now. But the truth is you claimed. You us right back. You became the children Eleanor and I never had nearby, the grandchildren we'd given up hoping for. Carlos looked around the room at the family photos on the mantel, at Eleanor's knitting basket by her chair, at Frank's reading, glasses on the side table, This house had become as much home to them as their own little white house up the hill. "So what do you say?" Frank asked. "Ready to stop being workers and start being owners?" Carlos looked at Maria, and she nodded, her eyes bright with tears and dreams. "Ready," Carlos said, just like he had that first night when Frank had opened his door to let them in. Some stories end with people finding what they were looking for. But the best stories end with people finding something they never knew they needed and discovering that sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the most unexpected blessings.